The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the rolling hills of Montana when Jake Wilson stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The steam from his coffee mixed with the cool morning air, creating small clouds that drifted away in the gentle breeze. At 53 years old, Jake had been working this ranch for nearly 3 decades, and he knew every inch of his 2,000 acres like the back of his weathered hands. But something was different this morning. Something that had been bothering him for weeks now. Duke, his 6-year-old German Shepherd mix, wasn't lying in his usual spot by the porch steps. Instead, the dog was standing at the far end of the yard, staring intently toward the eastern boundary of the property. His ears were perked up, his body rigid with attention, and his tail was held low and still. Jake frowned and called out, "Duke, come here, boy." The dog turned his head briefly, acknowledging his owner's voice, but then immediately returned his gaze to whatever had captured his attention in the distance. This wasn't normal behavior for Duke. The dog had always been obedient, always eager to please, and always ready for his morning routine of checking the cattle and walking the fence lines. Jake set his coffee mug on the porch railing and walked over to where Duke stood. He followed the dog's line of sight, squinting against the morning sun. All he could see was the rolling prairie grass that stretched toward the old railway corridor that cut through the corner of his property. Those tracks hadn't seen a train in over 30 years, not since the Burlington Northern Railway had abandoned the line back in the early 90s. "What's got you so worked up, buddy?" Jake asked, scratching behind Duke's ears. But even his touch couldn't break the dog's intense focus. This strange behavior had started about 3 weeks ago. At first, Jake had dismissed it as Duke chasing rabbits or maybe catching the scent of deer that occasionally wandered through the property. But as the days passed, the behavior became more pronounced and more troubling. Duke had begun spending entire nights by the eastern fence line. Jake would wake up in the morning to find the dog's bed empty, and Duke standing guard at the property's edge. The dog would come when called for meals and his regular duties around the ranch, but the moment he was free, he would return to that same spot and resume his vigilant watch. Even more concerning was how Duke's appetite had started to diminish. The dog who once devoured his meals with enthusiasm now picked at his food, eating just enough to get by. Jake had taken him to the veterinarian in town, Dr. Peterson, who had examined Duke thoroughly and found nothing wrong. "He's in perfect health," Dr. Peterson had told Jake. "Sometimes dogs can sense things we can't. Changes in weather, underground activity, even illness in other animals. Has anything changed on your property recently?" Jake had thought about it carefully. Nothing had changed. The cattle were healthy, the fences were in good repair, and he hadn't noticed any unusual wildlife activity. The only thing he could think of was that old railway corridor, but nothing ever happened out there. It was just empty prairie and rusted tracks. As the days continued, Duke's behavior became even more intense. The dog would whine softly at night, a sound that carried through the quiet ranch house and kept Jake awake. During the day, Duke would pace along the fence line, back and forth like a sentry on duty. Jake's neighbors had started to notice too. Betty Rodriguez, who owned the adjacent ranch to the south, had mentioned it when she stopped by to borrow some tools. "Your dog's been acting strange lately," she had said, glancing toward where Duke stood at his usual post. "Miguel saw him out there at 3 in the morning last Tuesday, just standing and staring. Is everything all right?" Jake had assured her that everything was fine, but privately he was becoming more concerned. Duke had always been an excellent judge of character and had an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it arrived. Over the years, the dog had alerted Jake to everything from sick cattle to approaching storms. Duke's instincts had never been wrong. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in late September. Jake had been lying in bed trying to fall asleep despite Duke's soft whimpering from outside, when the dog suddenly burst into a series of sharp, urgent barks. These weren't the territorial barks Duke used to warn off coyotes or announce visitors. These were different, desperate, almost frantic. Jake threw on his clothes and rushed outside, grabbing his flashlight from the kitchen counter. He found Duke at the fence line, his entire body tense with agitation. The dog was alternating between sharp barks and low, throaty growls, his hackles raised. "What is it, boy? What do you see?" Jake swept his flashlight beam across the dark prairie, but he couldn't see anything unusual. The night was clear, with a half moon providing some additional light, but beyond the fence line everything looked normal. just grass and shadows and the distant silhouette of the abandoned railway embankment. But Duke's agitation was unmistakable. The dog was practically vibrating with tension, and when Jake tried to lead him back to the house, Duke resisted, planting his feet and refusing to move away from his post. That's when Jake made a decision that would change everything. He had to find out what was causing Duke's distress, not just for the dog's sake, but for his own peace of mind. Something was out there. Something that Duke could sense, but Jake couldn't see or smell or hear. And if Duke was this worked up about it, it was probably something important. The next morning, Jake prepared for an expedition to the eastern part of his property. He loaded his ATV with water, some basic tools, and his rifle, not because he expected trouble, but because any responsible rancher always carried protection when venturing into remote areas of his land. Duke seemed to sense that something was different about this morning. As soon as Jake headed toward the ATV, the dog's entire demeanor changed. His tail began to wag for the first time in weeks, and he started pacing excitedly between Jake and the eastern fence line. "All right, boy," Jake said, patting Duke's head. "Let's go see what's got you so worried." As they approached the gate that led to the eastern pasture, Duke's excitement became almost uncontainable. The dog was whining with anticipation, his eyes bright and alert. Jake opened the gate, and Duke immediately bolted forward, not running wild but moving with purpose, following a direct path toward the abandoned railway corridor. Jake followed on his ATV, bouncing over the rough terrain as Duke led the way. The dog would run ahead, then stop and look back to make sure Jake was following, then continue on his determined path. It was clear that Duke knew exactly where he was going. The railway corridor was about 2 miles from the main ranch buildings, across rolling hills and through patches of scrub brush and prairie grass. Jake had ridden out this way occasionally over the years, usually when checking on cattle that had wandered too far from the main herd. But he had never paid much attention to the old railway infrastructure. It was just part of the landscape, as permanent and unremarkable as the hills themselves. As they got closer to the tracks, Duke's behavior became even more intense. The dog was practically vibrating with energy, and he kept looking back at Jake with an expression that seemed to say, "Hurry up, we're almost there." Jake could see the old railway embankment rising ahead of them, covered with tall grass and brush that had grown wild over the decades since the line was abandoned. Scattered along the corridor were various pieces of old railway equipment, sections of rusted track, abandoned rail cars, and somewhere in the distance, he knew there was an old locomotive that had been left behind when the line was decommissioned. Duke led him directly toward that locomotive. As they approached the area where the old train engine sat, Jake began to understand why this part of his property had always seemed so unremarkable. The engine was almost completely hidden by vegetation. Decades of growth had surrounded it, making it blend into the landscape so completely that unless you knew exactly where to look, you might walk right past it without noticing. But Duke knew exactly where it was, and he was heading straight for it with a determination that made Jake's heart begin to race. Whatever had been bothering his dog for the past 3 weeks, whatever had been keeping him awake at night and stealing his appetite, it was connected to that old train engine. And as Jake followed Duke across the last 100 yards of prairie grass, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Duke had never been wrong about danger before, and the intensity of the dog's behavior suggested that whatever they were about to discover was more significant than just an old piece of abandoned railway equipment. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as they approached their destination, casting long shadows across the prairie and illuminating the hidden secrets that had been waiting in the wilderness for someone to find them. The old locomotive loomed ahead of them like a sleeping giant from another era. Jake had seen it before, of course, during his occasional rides through this part of the property, but he had never really looked at it closely. From a distance, it had always seemed like just another piece of abandoned machinery, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But now, following Duke's urgent lead, Jake was seeing it with new eyes. The engine was larger than he had remembered, a massive piece of 1940s engineering that must have weighed dozens of tons. It was a steam locomotive, built in an age when trains were the lifeline of rural America, carrying goods and people across vast distances. This particular engine had probably hauled grain and cattle and passengers for decades before the railway company decided that this remote line was no longer profitable. Duke reached the locomotive first and immediately began circling it with an intensity that made Jake's pulse quicken. The dog wasn't just investigating randomly. He was focused on something specific. His nose was working constantly, sniffing the air and the ground around the engine, and his body language suggested he was tracking a scent. Jake parked his ATV about 20 feet away and approached on foot, his boots crunching through the dry grass and fallen leaves that carpeted the ground around the engine. Up close, he could see that the locomotive was in better condition than he had expected, while the exterior showed obvious signs of decades of weather exposure, rust stains, peeling paint, and patches where the metal had corroded. The main structure was still solid and intact. What struck him as odd was how the vegetation around the engine had been disturbed. While most of the area was overgrown with tall prairie grass and scrub brush, there were clear paths through the growth, as if someone had been walking around the engine regularly. The grass was trampled down in certain areas, and some of the brush had been broken or pushed aside. Duke was becoming increasingly agitated, focusing his attention on the side of the locomotive, where several access panels were located. These panels, designed to allow maintenance workers to reach the engine's internal mechanisms, were partially concealed by rust and grime. But as Jake looked more closely, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The panels showed signs of recent tampering. While the locomotive's exterior was uniformly weathered and aged, the area around one particular access panel was different. The rust had been scraped away in places, revealing bare metal underneath. There were fresh scratches in the metal, and the panel itself didn't sit quite flush with the rest of the engine's surface. Someone had been here recently, and they had been working on this engine. Duke was now pawing frantically at the base of the panel, whining with an urgency that Jake had never heard before. The dog would scratch at the metal for a few seconds, then look up at Jake as if trying to communicate something important, then return to his scratching. Jake knelt down beside Duke and examined the panel more closely. It was about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, held in place by several large bolts that should have been rusted solid after 30 years of abandonment. But when Jake tried to turn one of the bolts with his fingers, it moved easily. Too easily. Someone had been maintaining these bolts. Someone had been opening this panel on a regular basis. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. This wasn't just an abandoned locomotive sitting forgotten on his property. Someone was using it for something, and they had been coming here regularly enough to keep the access mechanisms in working order. Jake stood up and walked around the entire locomotive, looking for other signs of recent activity. What he found made his growing concern turn into genuine alarm. On the far side of the engine, hidden from view of anyone approaching from the direction of his ranch buildings, he discovered a small area where the ground had been deliberately cleared and leveled. Fresh tire tracks were visible in the dirt, and he could see where someone had set up what looked like a temporary campsite. There were the remains of a small fire pit, carefully constructed with rocks that definitely hadn't been there naturally. Scattered around the area were cigarette butts, food wrappers, and other trash that showed recent human activity. Someone had been coming here regularly, and they had been here recently enough that the evidence hadn't been scattered by wind or weather. But most disturbing of all was what Jake found when he looked more carefully at the locomotive's surroundings. Hidden among the overgrown vegetation were several items that definitely didn't belong in an abandoned railway corridor. There was a small camouflage tarp, carefully folded and wedged between two sections of the engine's undercarriage. Nearby, he found a plastic water container and what appeared to be a portable radio antenna, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Duke had followed Jake around to this side of the locomotive, and the dog's agitation had reached a fever pitch. He was alternating between sharp barks and low growls, his hackles raised and his entire body tense with alarm. Whatever scent Duke was following, it was strongest here, on this hidden side of the engine. Jake pulled out his cell phone to call the sheriff, but discovered he had no signal. This remote part of his property had always been a dead zone for cell coverage, which was one of the reasons he rarely came out here. He was completely cut off from help, alone except for Duke, and increasingly certain that he had stumbled onto something dangerous. But Duke wasn't finished showing him things. The dog had returned to the access panel on the side of the locomotive and was scratching at it with renewed intensity. His claws were scraping against the metal, creating a sharp grating sound that echoed across the empty prairie. Jake realized that Duke wanted him to open the panel. The dog had brought him here for a specific purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it involved getting inside this locomotive. Jake returned to his ATV and retrieved a toolkit from the storage compartment. Among the tools was a large adjustable wrench that should be able to handle the bolts on the access panel. As he walked back toward the locomotive, his hands were shaking slightly. He had no idea what he might find inside the engine, but Duke's behavior suggested it was something significant. The bolts came off easily, confirming Jake's suspicion that someone had been maintaining them. As he removed the last bolt, the panel swung open on hinges that moved, smoothly and quietly, another sign that they had been recently oiled and maintained. What Jake saw when he peered inside the locomotive made him step back in shock. The interior of the engine had been completely gutted and converted into something else entirely. Where there should have been boilers and pistons and all the mechanical components of a steam locomotive, there was instead a carefully constructed living space. The walls had been lined with insulation and plywood, creating a hidden room that was invisible from the outside. But this wasn't just a simple shelter. Someone had put considerable time, effort, and money into creating this hidden space. There was battery-powered lighting, a small camping stove, and what appeared to be sophisticated electronic equipment. Cables ran along the walls, connecting various devices that Jake couldn't immediately identify. Duke pushed past Jake and jumped into the hidden compartment, his nose working frantically as he investigated every corner of the space. The dog's behavior suggested that this place had been occupied recently, very recently. Jake climbed into the compartment after Duke, his flashlight beam revealing more details of this incredible discovery. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside, extending back into what had once been the locomotive's main boiler compartment. Someone had done major construction work to create this hideout, removing tons of original equipment and replacing it with a custom-built interior. On one wall, Jake found shelves stocked with military-style rations, bottled water, and other supplies that suggested long-term occupation. There were sleeping bags, camping gear, and personal items that indicated this wasn't just a temporary shelter. Someone had been living here. But what really caught Jake's attention were the maps spread out on a makeshift table in the center of the space. These weren't ordinary road maps or topographical surveys. They were detailed drawings of local infrastructure: power lines, water treatment facilities, communication towers, and transportation hubs. Some of the locations were marked with red ink, and there were notes written in the margins that Jake couldn't read in the dim light. Among the maps, Jake spotted something that made his heart skip a beat. There were photographs scattered across the table, and some of them showed his own ranch. Aerial photos that must have been taken from a drone or aircraft, showing his house, his barn, his cattle pens, and even his daily routes around the property. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been studying his property in detail, documenting his routines and activities. The photographs were recent. He could tell because they showed repairs he had made to his barn roof just 2 months ago. Duke had found something else that was capturing his attention. In the far corner of the hidden compartment, partially concealed by a tarp, were several large cases that looked like they might contain weapons or other equipment. The dog was sniffing around these cases with particular intensity, occasionally letting out small whines of concern. Jake realized that he was in way over his head. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he was sure whoever was approaching would be able to hear it. The sound of the vehicle engine was getting closer, and he could now distinguish that it was actually 2 vehicles, maybe 3, approaching from different directions. These people weren't just casually stumbling onto the locomotive. They were coordinating their approach like a military operation. Duke had positioned himself at the entrance to the hidden compartment, his body low and tense, ready to spring into action. The dog's instincts were screaming danger, and Jake knew they had to move fast if they were going to avoid a confrontation. But first, Jake needed to gather as much evidence as possible. If something happened to him, someone needed to know what he had discovered. Working quickly in the dim light filtering through the access panel, he continued photographing everything he could see. The military-style cases that had caught Duke's attention were locked, but Jake could see labels on them that made his blood run cold. Some bore markings that suggested they contained explosives or other dangerous materials. Others were labeled with technical terms that Jake didn't recognize, but that sounded ominous. On the makeshift table, beyond the maps and surveillance photos, Jake found a notebook filled with handwritten plans and schedules. The handwriting was neat and precise, like someone with military training. As he flipped through the pages, taking photos of each one, Jake began to understand the scope of what he had uncovered. This wasn't just a single person hiding out on his property. This was an organized group with a detailed plan to attack multiple targets across the region. The notebook contained lists of names, addresses, and what appeared to be security assessments of various facilities. There were timing charts, supply lists, and communication protocols that suggested a level of organization that was truly frightening. One page in particular made Jake's hands shake as he photographed it. It was a detailed schedule for something called Operation Prairie Fire, planned for the following week. The targets included the regional power grid, 3 water treatment facilities, a major highway bridge, and several government buildings in nearby towns. But what made it even more terrifying was the level of detail about civilian casualties. The planners had calculated how many people would be affected by each attack, and they seemed to view those casualties not as an unfortunate side effect, but as part of the goal. The vehicle engines were very close now, and Jake could hear doors slamming and voices calling to each other. Duke let out a low growl and pressed himself against Jake's leg, clearly wanting to get out of there immediately. Jake stuffed the notebook into his jacket along with the other evidence he had gathered. He had to get this information to the authorities no matter what. But as he prepared to leave the compartment, he noticed something else that stopped him cold. In the corner where the weapons cases were stored, there was a communications setup that was more sophisticated than anything he had expected to find in a remote hideout. Multiple radios, computer equipment, and what appeared to be satellite communication gear. Cables ran from this equipment through holes that had been drilled in the locomotive's wall, presumably to external antennas hidden in the surrounding vegetation. This wasn't just a planning center. It was an active command post for a larger operation. Jake realized that this locomotive was probably just one of several similar hideouts scattered across the region. The communications equipment would allow the various cells to coordinate their attacks, and the remote location made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to detect their activities. The voices outside were getting closer, and Jake could make out individual words now. The people approaching were speaking in the clipped, efficient tones of people who were used to working together under pressure. Military veterans, maybe, or people with similar training. "Check the perimeter first," one voice called out. "Make sure we weren't followed." "Roger that," came the reply. "Alpha team, circle around to the south approach. Bravo team, cover the north side." Jake's blood went cold. These people were using military terminology and tactics. This wasn't a group of amateurs playing at being soldiers. These were people with real training and experience. Duke was now pulling at Jake's jacket, trying to get him to move toward the entrance. The dog had clearly heard enough to know that staying in the compartment was not an option. But Jake was afraid that trying to leave now would only expose them to the people outside. Then he heard something that made his decision for him. "Somebody's been here," one of the voices said, much closer to the locomotive than before. "These tracks by the ATV are fresh. Could be from this morning." "Check the access panel," another voice ordered. "If someone's found our setup, we need to know how much they saw." Jake realized that his ATV, parked 20 feet away from the locomotive, had given away his presence. There was no way to hide the fact that someone had been here recently, and it was only a matter of seconds before these people discovered the open access panel. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake crept toward the entrance of the compartment. Duke was ahead of him, every muscle in the dog's body coiled and ready for action. Jake peered out through the opening and saw 2 men in camouflage clothing, approaching the locomotive from different directions. Both were carrying weapons, military-style rifles that they handled with obvious familiarity. Between Jake and his ATV were 3 armed men who were clearly searching for whoever had disturbed their hideout. There was no way to reach his vehicle without being seen, and no way to escape on foot across the open prairie without being caught. But Jake noticed something that gave him hope. The men were focused on the immediate area around the locomotive, but they hadn't yet expanded their search to include the thick brush and tall grass that grew in patches around the railway corridor. If he could get Duke and himself into that vegetation without being spotted, they might be able to work their way back toward the main ranch buildings. Jake waited until the closest searcher had moved to the far side of the locomotive, then quietly slipped out of the compartment. Duke followed immediately, staying low and moving silently despite his obvious agitation. Together they crept toward a patch of brush about 30 feet away from the locomotive. They had almost reached cover when Jake heard the shout that meant their escape attempt had been discovered. The access panel's open. Someone's been inside. Find them, came the immediate response. They can't have gone far. Jake and Duke broke into a run, crashing through the brush as quietly as they could manage while still moving fast enough to put distance between themselves and the armed searchers. Behind them, Jake could hear orders being shouted and the sound of people running in their direction. 3 men, spread out. Check all the vegetation! Whoever was here might still be in the area. Jake led Duke deeper into the brush, following what appeared to be an old animal trail that wound through the thickest part of the vegetation. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but it provided cover and seemed to lead in the general direction of his ranch buildings. As they moved through the brush, Jake could hear the searchers working systematically through the area around the locomotive. These people knew what they were doing. They were conducting a professional search pattern that would eventually cover every possible hiding place. Jake realized that their only chance was to get far enough away to find cell phone coverage and call for help. The evidence he had gathered in the locomotive would mean nothing if he and Duke didn't survive to share it with the authorities. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Jake and Duke emerged from the brush onto a section of his property that Jake recognized. They were about a mile from the locomotive, in an area where he sometimes found cattle that had wandered away from the main herd. More importantly, they were in an area where his cell phone might actually work. Jake pulled out his phone and was relieved to see 2 bars of signal strength. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to make a call. He dialed 911, and after what seemed like an eternity, the call connected. 911. What's your emergency? This is Jake Wilson, he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite his racing heart. I'm a rancher in Crow County, and I've discovered what appears to be a terrorist cell operating on my property. They have weapons, explosives, and detailed plans to attack civilian targets. I need immediate assistance. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then the dispatcher's voice became much more focused and urgent. Sir, can you repeat that? Did you say terrorist cell? Yes, Jake confirmed. I found a hidden command post in an abandoned locomotive on my property. They have maps, weapons, communications equipment, and detailed plans for attacks scheduled for next week. I have photographs of everything, but I'm currently hiding from armed individuals who are searching for me. What's your exact location, sir? Jake gave the dispatcher his coordinates and a detailed description of where he was hiding. He also provided information about the locomotive's location and the number of armed individuals he had seen. Sir, I'm dispatching multiple units to your location immediately, the dispatcher said. This is going to include federal agents as well as local law enforcement. Can you stay on the line with me? I'll try, Jake said, but my battery is getting low and the signal out here isn't very strong. Jake and Duke had been hiding in the thick brush for what felt like hours when they heard the first distant sound of sirens. The sound was still far away, but it was definitely getting closer, and Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. Help was finally coming. Duke's ears perked up at the sound, and the dog looked at Jake as if to say, I told you this was important. For the first time since they had discovered the hidden compartment in the locomotive, Duke's body language showed signs of relaxation. The dog had been tense and alert since they started their escape, constantly monitoring the sounds around them for signs of pursuit. The sirens were getting louder now, and Jake could distinguish multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. It sounded like a major response, not just the local sheriff's department, but multiple agencies coordinating their arrival. Jake realized that his 911 call had triggered exactly the kind of response that a terrorist threat should receive. But even as help approached, Jake knew that the people using the locomotive hideout would probably try to escape before law enforcement arrived. These were clearly experienced and well-organized individuals who would have contingency plans for exactly this situation. They had been operating undetected for weeks or possibly months, which meant they were careful and professional in their approach to security. Jake decided to risk moving to a position where he could observe the locomotive and see what was happening. Moving carefully through the brush, with Duke following close behind, he worked his way to a small rise that offered a view of the railway corridor while still providing cover. What he saw when he peered through the vegetation confirmed his fears. The people at the locomotive were moving with urgent efficiency, loading equipment and supplies into vehicles. Jake could see at least 6 individuals now, all wearing military-style clothing and all armed. They were clearly preparing to abandon the site and disappear before law enforcement could arrive. 2 large SUVs and what appeared to be a military-style truck were parked near the locomotive, hidden from view by the natural terrain features. Jake realized that these people had been using an access route that he hadn't even known existed, probably an old maintenance road that connected to the abandoned railway system. The sirens were much closer now, and Jake could see flashing lights in the distance. But the people at the locomotive were working fast, and it looked like they might be able to complete their evacuation before the authorities arrived. Jake watched as several of the men emerged from the hidden compartment carrying the cases he had seen earlier, the ones that appeared to contain weapons and explosives. They loaded these cases into the vehicles with the kind of careful handling that suggested the contents were indeed dangerous. One of the men was clearly in charge, directing the others and constantly checking a radio or communication device. Jake wished he had binoculars or some way to get a better look at these individuals, but even from his hiding place, he could see that they moved with the kind of coordination that came from extensive training and practice. The leader suddenly stopped what he was doing and raised his hand, apparently receiving some kind of communication through his earpiece. He said something to the others that Jake couldn't hear, but their response was immediate and urgent. They began moving even faster, abandoning some of their equipment in their haste to evacuate. Jake realized that the people at the locomotive probably had spotters positioned around the area who were reporting on the approaching law enforcement vehicles. These weren't amateurs who might panic at the first sign of trouble. They had a professional surveillance and communication network that was giving them real-time intelligence about the response to Jake's discovery. The first law enforcement vehicles were now visible in the distance, racing across the prairie toward the locomotive. Jake could see at least 4 vehicles, kicking up clouds of dust as they bounced over the rough terrain, but the people at the locomotive had almost completed their evacuation. Jake watched in frustration as the last of the equipment was loaded into the vehicles. The leader was making a final check of the hidden compartment, probably ensuring that nothing incriminating was left behind. Then he emerged and made a hand signal to the others. The engines of the 3 vehicles started simultaneously, and Jake realized that the group was about to escape just minutes before law enforcement arrived. All the evidence of their operation, all the weapons and plans and communications equipment, would disappear with them. But then something unexpected happened. Duke, who had been lying quietly beside Jake throughout their observation of the evacuation, suddenly stood up and let out a series of sharp, piercing barks that echoed across the prairie. The sound was so loud and unexpected that even Jake was startled. The effect on the people at the locomotive was immediate and dramatic. They clearly hadn't known that anyone was still in the area, and Duke's barking told them not only that someone was watching them, but approximately where that person was located. Jake tried to quiet Duke, but the dog was not to be silenced. He continued barking with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what he was doing. This wasn't panic or fear. This was Duke making a deliberate choice to reveal their position. At first, Jake thought Duke had made a terrible mistake that would get them both killed. The people at the locomotive were pointing in their direction, and several of them were raising their weapons. But then Jake realized what Duke was actually accomplishing. The dog's barking was delaying the evacuation. The leader was clearly torn between the need to escape immediately and the need to deal with the witness who was observing their operation. The group had stopped their vehicles and was now focused on the area where Jake and Duke were hiding, trying to determine whether they faced an immediate threat. Those few minutes of delay made all the difference. The first law enforcement vehicle crested a hill less than half a mile from the locomotive, followed immediately by 3 more vehicles. The approaching officers would be able to see the evacuation in progress, and the people at the locomotive would not be able to escape without a chase. The leader made a quick decision. Instead of trying to hunt down Jake and Duke, he signaled for his people to proceed with their escape. The 3 vehicles accelerated away from the locomotive, following what appeared to be a well-planned escape route through the rough terrain, but they were too late. Jake watched as additional law enforcement vehicles appeared from other directions, clearly coordinating to surround the area Someone had done their homework about the terrain and the possible escape routes, and the response was being conducted with the same level of professionalism that the terrorist group had shown in their planning. One of the escaping vehicles, the military-style truck, got bogged down in a patch of soft ground near an old creek bed. The occupants abandoned the vehicle and scattered on foot, but Jake could see officers moving to intercept them. The two SUVs made it further, but they were being pursued by law enforcement vehicles that were better suited for the rough terrain. A helicopter appeared in the distance, adding aerial surveillance to the coordinated response. Duke had stopped barking and was now watching the unfolding chase with obvious satisfaction. Jake realized that the dog had understood something that Jake himself had missed. By delaying the evacuation for just a few minutes, Duke had ensured that the terrorist group would not be able to escape cleanly. Within 20 minutes, Jake could see that all three vehicles had been stopped and their occupants were being taken into custody. The professional coordination of the law enforcement response was impressive. Multiple agencies working, together with the kind of efficiency that suggested they had trained for exactly this type of situation. As the immediate action died down, Jake heard his name being called through a loudspeaker. "Jake Wilson, this is Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI. We know you're in the area and we need to speak with you. You're not in any danger from us. Please respond if you can hear this." Jake stood up carefully with Duke beside him and waved toward the officers near the locomotive. Within minutes, he was surrounded by federal agents, county sheriff's deputies, and what appeared to be members of a specialized tactical team. Special Agent Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of calm authority that came from extensive experience with serious situations. She approached Jake with her badge visible and her weapon holstered. "Mr. Wilson, I'm Agent Rodriguez. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm fine," Jake replied. "But I have evidence that you need to see. These people were planning attacks for next week." Jake pulled out his cell phone and showed Agent Rodriguez the photographs he had taken in the hidden compartment. As she scrolled through the images, her expression became increasingly serious. "Mr. Wilson, what you've discovered here is extremely significant. We're going to need you to walk us through everything you found in detail." Over the next hour, Jake led a team of federal agents through the locomotive's hidden compartment, explaining what he had seen and where he had found each piece of evidence. The agents photographed and cataloged everything, treating the locomotive as a crime scene that would provide crucial evidence for prosecution. Agent Rodriguez explained that the group Jake had discovered was part of a larger domestic terrorism network. 2 weeks after the discovery at the locomotive, Jake's phone rang at 6 o'clock in the morning. He had gotten used to early morning calls from federal agents, reporters, and other officials who wanted to discuss the case. But this call was different. "Mr. Wilson, this is Agent Rodriguez. I'm calling with an update that I thought you'd want to hear immediately. We've successfully arrested the last members of the terrorist network. The final operation was completed last night in Nevada." Jake sat up in bed, fully awake now. "How many people total?" 12 individuals across 6 states, Agent Rodriguez replied. "The evidence you and Duke helped us recover led to every single arrest. Without that locomotive hideout, we never would have been able to map the entire network." Over the past 2 weeks, Jake had learned the full scope of what Duke's discovery had prevented. The terrorist network had been planning simultaneous attacks on rural infrastructure across Montana, Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, and Nevada. The goal had been to disrupt power, water, and communication systems across a vast area, creating chaos and panic while demonstrating the vulnerability of rural communities. The attacks had been scheduled to begin just 3 days after Jake found the locomotive hideout. If Duke hadn't led him to that discovery when he did, hundreds of people could have been killed or injured, and millions more would have been affected by the infrastructure damage. "The media attention has been overwhelming," Jake told Agent Rodriguez. "I never expected anything like this, it was true." Jake's quiet ranch had become the center of national attention as news of the thwarted terrorist plot spread across the country. Reporters from major television networks, newspapers, and magazines had descended on his property, all wanting to interview the rancher and his dog who had uncovered the conspiracy. Duke, in particular, had become something of a celebrity. The story of the German Shepherd mix who had detected danger and led his owner to a terrorist hideout had captured the public imagination. Jake had received thousands of letters and emails from people across the country, praising Duke's instincts and thanking them both for preventing the attacks. But the attention hadn't always been welcome. Jake was a private person who valued the quiet solitude of ranch life, and having his property overrun with reporters and curiosity seekers had been difficult to handle. He had been forced to hire additional security and put up new fencing to keep unwanted visitors away from his family and livestock. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Agent Rodriguez continued. "The Department of Homeland Security would like to present Duke with a special commendation for his role in preventing these attacks. It's an honor that's rarely given to civilian animals, and we think Duke deserves the recognition." Jake looked down at Duke, who was lying on his bed beside him, ears perked up as if he knew he was being discussed. The dog had returned to his normal behavior since the discovery at the locomotive, but Jake noticed that Duke still paid extra attention to the eastern part of the property during their daily rounds. "That would be an honor," Jake said. "When and where would this ceremony take place?" "We're planning a ceremony at the state capitol next month. The governor will be there, along with representatives from multiple federal agencies. We're also planning to use the ceremony to announce a new rural security initiative that was inspired partly by your discovery." The Rural Security Initiative was something that Jake had been discussing with federal officials for the past 2 weeks. The investigation had revealed that terrorist groups were increasingly targeting rural areas because they were perceived as having less security and fewer law enforcement resources than urban areas. Jake had proposed the creation of a network of rural residents who would be trained to recognize signs of suspicious activity and report them to authorities. The program would be similar to neighborhood watch programs in cities, but adapted for the unique challenges and geography of rural areas. "The program is going to be called the Rural Guardian Network," Agent Rodriguez explained. "We want to train ranchers, farmers, and other rural residents to be the eyes and ears for law enforcement in remote areas. Your experience shows how effective civilians can be at detecting threats that might otherwise go unnoticed." Jake was excited about the program, but he also understood the challenges it would face. Rural communities were often skeptical of government programs, and many residents valued their privacy and independence above security concerns. The program would need to be carefully designed to respect rural values while still providing effective security coverage. "We've already had over 300 applications from people who want to participate in the pilot program," Agent Rodriguez continued. "Your story has really resonated with rural communities across the country." Jake had been surprised by the positive response from other ranchers and farmers. He had expected some criticism for bringing federal attention to rural areas, but instead, most of the feedback had been supportive. Many rural residents had expressed gratitude that someone was finally taking rural security seriously. The investigation had also revealed how sophisticated the terrorist threat to rural areas had become. The group that had been using Jake's property was just one part of a larger movement that saw rural infrastructure as an attractive target. Power grids, water systems, transportation networks, and communication facilities in rural areas were often less protected than their urban counterparts, making them vulnerable to attack. "There's one more thing," Agent Rodriguez said. "The president wants to meet you and Duke. The White House is planning a ceremony to honor civilian heroes, and you're going to be among the people recognized." Jake was speechless. He had never imagined that following his dog's instincts would lead to a meeting with the President of the United States. But he also understood that the recognition wasn't really about him. It was about the importance of ordinary citizens staying vigilant and reporting suspicious activity. Over the following weeks, Jake's life became a whirlwind of ceremonies, interviews, and official recognition. The ceremony at the state capitol was attended by hundreds of people, including many of Jake's neighbors and fellow ranchers. Duke received his commendation with dignity, sitting calmly on stage while officials praised his role in preventing the terrorist attacks. The Rural Guardian Network was officially launched at the same ceremony, with Jake serving as the program's first official spokesperson. Training materials were distributed to rural communities across the country, teaching residents how to recognize signs of suspicious activity and how to report their concerns to appropriate authorities. The White House ceremony was even more overwhelming. Jake and Duke were flown to Washington, D.C., where they met with the president and other officials. The president praised Jake for his willingness to investigate something that seemed unusual, and he specifically commended Duke for his instincts and persistence. "This dog represents the best of American values," the president said during the ceremony. "Loyalty, vigilance, and the courage to act when something isn't right. Duke and his owner have shown us that heroes come in all forms, and that ordinary citizens can make an extraordinary difference in protecting our country." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from Jake's own community. The town council in the nearest municipality passed a resolution honoring both Jake and Duke, and the local veterinary clinic created a special award for animals who serve their communities with distinction. Dr. Peterson, Duke's veterinarian, had been particularly pleased with the recognition. "I always knew Duke was a special dog," he told Jake during a follow-up visit, "but I never imagined his instincts would lead to something this significant." The investigation and trials that followed the arrests consumed much of Jake's time over the next year. He testified before federal courts, congressional committees, and various investigative panels. The evidence he and Duke had discovered was crucial in convicting all 12 members of the terrorist network. The trials revealed the full extent of the planned attacks and the sophisticated nature of the terrorist organization. The group had been recruiting members for over 2 years, focusing on individuals with military or technical backgrounds who were disaffected with the government. They had conducted extensive surveillance of potential targets and had acquired significant quantities of weapons and explosives. The sentences handed down by federal judges were severe, reflecting the seriousness of the planned attacks and the potential for mass casualties. The leader of the group received life in prison without the possibility of parole, while other members received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. But for Jake, the most important outcome was the prevention of the attacks themselves. Every time he drove past the spot where the locomotive had been removed, he thought about what could have happened if Duke hadn't detected the presence of dangerous people on their property. The locomotive itself had been taken away as evidence and eventually destroyed. The railway corridor had been cleared of all vegetation and debris, and federal agencies had conducted an extensive environmental cleanup to remove any traces of hazardous materials that might have been stored there. Jake had initially been concerned about the cost of the cleanup and the potential impact on his ranch operations, but federal agencies